Hello, I will be discussing isometric or rigid transformation rules. You'll also hear about this being congruent transformations. So the transformations that I'm specifically talking about in this video will be translation, reflection, and rotation. So starting on your coordinate plane or what's given in your problem, X, Y, you're going to be asked to transform those coordinates. And when you're translating, what you're going to do is you're going to add to your X value, which is going to determine whether or not you're going left or right, or you're going to add or subtract to your Y value, which is telling you whether or not you're going up or down. So pay attention to the adjectives that are used. Left or right means horizontal, which is your X axis. Up and down means means vertical, and that's your Y axis. So pay attention to that, because sometimes they try to trick you and they'll write the descriptions backwards. I'll show you an instance in a few minutes. So reflection, again, if I'm starting off from my original X and Y values, I have two options in this case. And if I'm reflecting it over the X axis, what's going to happen is my X value is just going to remain the same. The only thing that's going to change is my Y is going to be multiplied times a -1. And then vice versa, if I'm trying to reflect over my Y axis, my Y value will remain the same. And then I am just simply going to multiply my X value by -1. If I am trying to rotate, I have a couple of options here. My first option that I am going to discuss is if I'm going from X, Y, I am literally going to rotate my X and my Y values. If I am going around the origin 90 degrees clockwise, which is the same as 270 degrees counterclockwise, then the only thing that I'm going to do, in addition to rotating my X and Y, is I'm going to multiply my X by -1. If I am rotating about the origin 90 degrees, but this time counterclockwise or 270 degrees clockwise, I am still going to rotate my X and my Y. However, I am going to multiply my Y value times -1. If I'm rotating about the origin 180 degrees, well, let's think about that. I'm going to end up in the same place no matter if I go clockwise or counterclockwise. So I'm not going to rotate my X and my Y values. However, I am going to multiply both my X and my Y by a -1. So let's review what the coordinate plane even looks like. So this is my coordinate plane, and I was discussing clockwise and counterclockwise. So think about a clock. That's why it's called clockwise, right? On a clock, if you look at the hands, they're going towards the right. So that's what clockwise looks like. Counterclockwise is just the opposite. I will be going in the other direction. So that's clockwise and counterclockwise. In terms of quadrants, you have 4 quadrants. So each of these little squares that I'm going to show to you are worth 90 degrees, starting from my X axis where I just highlighted, that's going to be 0. So if I go up to where the beginning of my Y axis starts, that is 90 degrees. So that's one quadrant. Add another 90, 180, another 90, 270, and finally 270 plus another 90 gives me 360. Yeah, it doesn't look like it, but that's a circle. You're going to understand this even more in future math courses, but for now, you should know that a circle measures 360 degrees, which is where we end up. So 0 and 360 will both end up on that x-axis there. Why is that important? Because when I'm trying to figure out in my quadrants, like quadrant 1, anything that goes there, like I said, they're 90 degrees, basically. That's what you really need to know. Each quadrant is worth 90 degrees, starting there. But I also want to pay attention to my signs. And my x-axis and my y-axis, they're just like number lines. So on the left-hand side, going upward, I'm counting upward, basically. On the left-hand side, those are my negative numbers. On the right-hand side, those are my positive numbers, left and right. Now, if I'm talking y-axis, on the bottom are my negative numbers, and on the top are my positive numbers. And I always go from bottom to top when I'm trying to describe something on my graph. So back to the signs. If I am talking about quadrant 1, I always start with my X values first. It's just like the alphabet, X comes before Y. So on my X axis, the numbers are counting upward, positive. On my Y axis, the same thing is happening in this quadrant. They're counting upward. They're both positive. So if any point or any figure is in quadrant 1, the coordinates will both have positive signs. If I go to quadrant 2, X's are negative, Y's are positive. That rule will never change for any of these. So then I'm just going to do the same thing for all of them. Quadrant 3, negative, negative. Quadrant 4, you guessed it, positive, negative. And notice I'm always starting with my X value. So pay attention to that. That's going to help you when you're trying to determine if your image coordinates are correct. What does that mean? So you have your starting figure, which is called your pre-image. That's your original figure. And then when you're transforming it, it is no longer called a pre-image, it's called the image. That's your resulting figure. So what would that look like if you were given 2 graphs, but they weren't color-coded like the ones that I'm about to show you? You would want to look at how it's labeled. So for instance, triangle ABC is simply ABC, right? But when I go to transform it and I get my resulting figure, which is known as my image, then now what I'm going to do is label it with what's called a prime symbol. And if I have multiple transformations, or if I have another one, a double transformation, I'm going to label it with a double prime. For this video, we're just doing one transformation. We're not going to do a double prime. For example 1, and you won't always know exactly what transformation it is, but I'm going to specifically tell you in each example which one you're working with until you become a little bit more familiar with it. So example 1, we're talking about transformation. We're talking about translations. In part A, it asked me to write a rule for the graph shown in words. So again, this is an instance where I would need to know which one was my original, so I'll know how to write my rule. Well, I know I'm going to be translating, so I'm just going to put translation. And then I just have to figure out which direction I'm going. If I look at what is labeled for the black figure, I notice it doesn't have a prime symbol. So I know that's my original figure. So I'm just going to take one at a time, starting with L. What did I have to do to go from L to L prime? What I had to do is go to the left, 1, 2, 3. So I'm just going to write that. I went to the left, 3, and then I had to go up, 1, 2. So up, 2. If this is a true translation, that means that each point will have those exact same rules. So for M, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Yep, that worked. And then for N, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So I know that's a true translation. You definitely want to take the time to check that. All right, now I'm going to take that information and I'm going to do part B, which says write a rule using arrow notation. Well, what that simply looks like is what I put in the chart. I started off with X, Y. Well, what happened? What happened with my X is I moved left 3, and left means subtract. So if I see the adjective left or down, that means I'm subtracting. Left means horizontal, so that goes with my X. Subtract by 3. And then what did I do for my Y? Y is either up or down. In this case, it says that I went up. Up means to add. So I added 2. So up and right means add. Okay, so that's going to go with my Y values. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at part C. Part C says to write the coordinates for the pre-image, which I've already done for you. Again, this is the pre-image. That's the one that is simply labeled as L, M, and N. It doesn't have the prime symbol. And if I went over, some people still don't understand how graphing works. So I went over 4. There's not a point there. I have to do 2 things. So not only did I go over 4, I had to go down 4, and I resulted in L. So that's where I got the 4, -4. So now I want to find the pre-image for each of those points. I'm sorry, the image. I just dealt with the pre-image. This is the pre-image. Those are the coordinates for that. The image is what happens after I complete this rule, this transformation. So it's going to become L prime now. And then I'm going to have an M prime and an N prime. So what I can do is use my rule. That's the easiest thing to do. My rule said take X and replace it there, and then subtract 3 from it. So if I did that, what's 4 minus 3? It's 1. And then it also says take -4, substitute it in for Y, and then add it to 2. What's -4 plus 2? -2. The other way is if I already have my graph, I can just simply go to the graph and see what happened. 1, -2. So it's the same. There's multiple ways to check that. The other thing you might want to do is you want to look at your signs. I noticed that L prime is in quadrant 4, so therefore my sign should be positive, negative, and it has to be in that order. And it was. So far, so good. You want to do that for each one. I'm not going to take the time to do it, but those were the ways that you can double check your work. All right, for M, I had 3, 0, but if I take this 3, substitute it in, 3 minus 3 is going to result in 0. And then if I take the 0 and substitute that in for Y, and make sure you're putting the X's with the X's and the Y's with the Y's. So 0 plus 2 is going to result in 2. And then finally, N prime is going to be -1 and -3. And that was just me substituting in 2 for X and subtracting 3, and then substituting -5 in for Y and adding 2. So those are my new coordinates for my image. And again, double check the quadrant. So for N prime, that is in quadrant 3, and both signs should be negative, which they are. Okay, take the time to just check your work. Example 2 is a reflection. For the reflection, we're going to write a rule for the graph. Now, again, you could check to see whether or not it was a translation, but we already know it's not. And how would I know it is? Every point would have to have the exact same rule. So for B, I moved over to the right 2. C, I can tell I did not move over to the right, so there's no way it's going to be a translation. So I can just move on to my other options, which would either be reflection or rotation. But I already told you it's reflection. So what do I want to do? So I did want to pay attention to what I just did. I moved over 2 places. Well, if I take half of that, that's going to tell me that I am reflecting over this line right here. But that has to be true for all the points. So let's just double check and see if that is true. So for C, I had to move over 1, 2, 3. And if it's true, it'll be half. So that's 3, right? And then on the opposite side, 1, 2, 3. So yes, so far, so good. And then for the last one, for A, it reflected over itself. And that is okay. That's fine. So my rule for this one would be reflection across, or you can say over, it depends how you want to write it, where X is equal to -2. Because again, this is my X axis, and where did I cross or reflect? Over where it crossed -2. So that line of symmetry is, if I were to take C and flip it over and reflect it, it's going to lay on top of that C prime because it reflected over X equals -2. So now I want to also go and I want to do the same thing I did a few minutes ago. And I want to define my coordinates for my image. I've already written it for my pre-image. My pre-image, again, is the one that's in black because it's just simply A, B, and C. So my image is going to be A prime, B prime, and C prime. And I'm just going to go ahead and write that out because I don't want to forget my prime symbols. And it's telling me that for A and A prime, they're exactly the same. So I can just leave that as -2 and -4. For my B prime, however, I had to, if I'm looking at my graph, it's -1 and 1. If I'm not looking at my graph, what did I have to do to get from B to B prime. Well, I already said we had to move over 2 times, right? Well, what I would have done then is taken my X, -3, and I moved over to the right. So that means I'm adding 2. What's -2 plus, I'm sorry, -3 plus 2? That's going to be my new X, which is -1. So that's where that came from. Again, multiple ways to check your work. You also want to look at what quadrant you're in and make sure those signs do line up. So it should be a negative X and a positive Y, which is what we have. For my C prime, I'm going to move that. I moved over to the left 6, so I can subtract 6 from my original X, which is going to leave me with -5. And -2 stays the same. Or I could just go to my actual graph and just look at it. I can see I had to go over to -5 and then down -2. So again, multiple ways. And I see I'm in quadrant 3, which means that both of my signs should be negative, which they are. So that's how you can double check that. What I also noticed is that my Y values did not change. They're exactly the same. And that's based off of the rule, one of the rules up there. All right, and then the last example is rotation. So what I want to do here is, again, if I did not know that it was a rotation transformation, I want to double check to see, well, if it's a translation, that means that all of the points would have to have the same rule, which means my F moved over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So therefore, my D would have to move over. My D is the same. It didn't move over at all. So I know that that's definitely not a transformation, a translation. And reflection would mean that it has to reflect over a specific line or area. And if I'm looking at this, I can tell that's not the case because my F's are here and then my E's are here. They're not reflecting over each other, basically. So therefore, I know I'm rotating. But which way am I rotating? If I look, let's just take F. So if I'm looking at F and I'm trying to get to F prime, well, I see that I'm actually going counterclockwise, but by how many degrees? Remember, each quadrant is worth 90 degrees. So if I'm already in quadrant 1 and I moved over to quadrant 2, that means that I moved by 90 degrees. So what I am going to write for my rules is that there is a rotation 90 degrees counterclockwise. Make sure that you, and I'm just abbreviating, make sure that you are specific and it's about the origin. And depending on how you look at it, you could also take the scenic route. You can go this way. That's 90 degrees plus another 90 is 180 plus another plus another 90 is 270. So you could also have said a rotation 270 degrees clockwise, because this time you notice my arrow, I'm going clockwise like the clock would go. So there's more than one way to actually explain this rule. And why am I saying about the origin? Because the same distance that it took me to go from C to the origin, it took me the same distance to C prime. And if I tested all of the points, it would be the exact same thing. So it's about the origin in this particular example. And then finally, if I wanted to write the image of the coordinates, I'm going to just go ahead and label C prime, D prime, because I know my image is going to have the prime symbol on it. That's how I can tell the difference between the figures. So for the first one, C is at 0 and then -2. Well, what is the coordinates for C prime? So I can literally count, and that is going to be +2 and 0. For D prime, again, if I'm just looking at my graph, I can count and just, since I didn't label this particular one. E prime is -3 and 1, and then F prime is -2 and 3. Now, what I can remember, if I go back to that chart that I gave you earlier, is that whenever I have a rotation 90 degrees counterclockwise, which is the same as 270 degrees clockwise, my rule says that what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my X's and my Y's, And then I'm going to multiply my x times the negative 1. So let's see if that's true. These were my x's, and I'm going to rotate them, and now they become my y. Notice I didn't change the sign because it didn't tell me to for my x values. However, when I look at my original y values, it says to multiply it times -1. So if I did that, then now -2 becomes +2. +2 becomes -2. Well, all the rest of them become negative. So this rule works. It's just a matter of you double checking to make sure you're following the correct rule. You also can, again, look at the coordinates and see if this is in fact true. So for C prime, it's saying that it should be a positive and a positive. Now, this one is that's not in the coordinate. It's simply on the x-axis. So whatever is shown on your x-axis is your value. So it's 2. And since I didn't move up or down, then my y is 0. Now let's look at D prime. That's a better one. That is in quadrant 3, which says that my signs should be negative and negative, which they are. So I could multiple ways to check this, okay? So I am finished. I think I've taught everything that I wanted to teach. Yeah, everything I want to teach. So if this was helpful, please feel free to subscribe and thumbs up. You guys have an awesome day.